Hi, folks. So today we have the initiator rational. Usually preferences ENTJ. Vanderhoek would have called this type, translated into English from Dutch or German, although his dominant language was Dutch. Would have been the extrovert of thinking type with subsidiary intuition, although we call it intuiting now. I picked that up from Dario Nardi. So you can see that I've added to this description of TE with the creative business logic, forming a company's processes. Even a creative subtype of ESTJ can do that, not just by the book. But in the case of ENTJ, in comparison with ESTJ, ENTJ is sort of by default utilitarian. So utilitarian means adaptive, because all rationals are somewhat arrogant in wanting to do something their own way. But there's a difference between NTJs and NTPs. I think the NTPs by default want to do something their own way. The NTJs with that focus on TE, by default, they want to do something the most efficient way. Or do a verb the most efficient way, not a thing. And so it doesn't matter if the by the book method is the most efficient method, they'll do it. Whereas I think NTPs can just sort of reinvent the wheel just for the ego of sort of doing it their own way. So that might be coming through the sort of the JP sort of dichotomy in MBTI. The focus is on efficiency for ENTJs rather than ingenuity, whereas for NTPs the focus is on ingenuity and ideas. Now, I'll get into it later. Ideas are also important in ENTJ, but it's going through that filter of TE. What is useful? And a bit like INTJ, every idea is subject to the test of usefulness. That's also a thing with ENTJs. So the main difference between ENTJ and INTJ, energy level. Huge difference in energy level. INTJ gets a lot done because they spend their energy very wisely, but they are sort of tight with time, energy, and money. Typically like the Enneagrammatic fixated 5 person. But I'm not going to go through all of the subfunctions because you can sort of read it. But so there's sort of 3 sort of big factors in this model. One is the clubs, and the clubs has been sort of, well, first of all, I know that Isabel Myers read Conscious Orientation by Vanderhoek because the book was referenced 10 times in Gifts Differum. Now, which makes me think, now because she read that book, Conscious Orientation, it makes me think that she got the idea of the clubs, that's NT, NF, SF, and ST, from Vanderhoek. Because look what we got here in 1937. Well, ethos with NF. I mean, what else could ethos refer to? It's not going to be... I mean, if you're doing a diagram, what other 2 could it refer to? You wouldn't do it as, okay, this is ethos, and that means feeling with sensor. And then morality would be, you see what I mean? Like if you were trying to like interpret it another way, it doesn't make sense. So it has to be like N and F is ethos, because if you were to go the other way, say feeling with sensing, and then you would say morality was sensing with thinking. So it doesn't work. So it has to go in the middle. And so logos for NT, and so technique with ST, morality. So he's sort of named it. So you can't say he's not come up with the clubs there. And the clubs are very important here. So for instance, ENFP, You got NF club, ST counter club, and then we've got a rational, NT club, SF counter club, or we would call it a counter nucleus in the field of conscious orientation. So, but getting on to, let's have a look at extroverting now, and because then I want to get on to another factor in my model, and that is the importance of default versus situational. It's one of these things in hindsight where it's like, yeah, it's obvious that, say, an extrovert, they have a preference for extroverts, and situationally they were introverts. You know, but I think it's like getting towards sort of these solid things that a model is built around, trying to be as scientific as possible, and sort of piggybacking a little bit on Dario's science. So we got here the focus of attention. Good line from NLP from Chris Howard. Your focus determines your reality. And so you got the focus of the ENTJ is on the world and doing things in the world. Now, frequently ENTJ is Enneagram 3 fixated and Enneagram 8 fixated. And I would say most ENTJs have got a 3 fix. I mean, Keirsey's ENTJ profile reads like a 3. So ENTJs are typically going to be 8 or 3. Yeah. Rarely you might get a 6. But pretty much 8 and 3. So the focus is on being in the world, and with that 8 fixation and 3 fixation, achievement in the world and controlling the world. And you've got some powerful functions there to do that with the valuing of the TE and the SE in ENTJ. And you've got that sort of a bit of weak FI that will develop later on. Yeah, so it's the self in the world and it's controlling the self. I'll just do a bit on, yeah, and also sort of like they've got this strategic intellect, but I'll get onto that later because I want to get onto extroverted and introverting. But so just shortly, I'll say, so you've got, let's see if I can remember the shortcuts. Is it Shift 8? I should disappear. It should be Shift 7. Doesn't, if I do it there. No, I don't disappear. It's supposed to be a shortcut where I'll disappear. What was I supposed to do? Shift 6. Shift 6. And then I'll go away. No, it doesn't work. Anyway. I'll press that one. Shift 8. No, don't come back. Shift 8 and Shift 7. Right. Right. So one of the typical things that you get with a typical theme in ENTJ is a sort of this predisposition towards the way they control the environment is, and they've got this strategic intellect of this long range planning. And so Keirsey came up with this idea of these sort of like coordinator roles that the ENTJ is predisposed to, and that it's best suited towards the coordinator mobilizer role. And so that is sort of like you're mobilizing resources towards a long-term strategic objective. And that sort of like social role is going to draw on TE in terms of like getting the sequence of operations correct towards a long-term objective, and also this sort of intuition of time aspect of NI. And so the role is drawing on TE and NI, and therefore Keirsey's role sort of corresponds to ENTJ with that function pair. So ENTJ is a type best set up to enact that role. So now we're going to get on to extroversion in general in the ENTJ, and sort of like what are the consequences of that, and the fact that ENTJ is going to be pretty good at all the extroverting functions, especially basic uses of those. So I will put there like just a little bit about what I used to call it and all of that. Right. I'll read this bit out here. Right, I think these two are important. Right, for extroverting types, the default operating mode is, you guessed it, extroverting. This means the type defaults to extroverting, i.e. directing attention outwards towards action in the world and empirical data such as immediate sensory instinctual data, SE, social customs, morality, body language, especially facial expressions and tone of voice, signifying feelings, FE. So you can see all of this is empirical. Social customs, morality are there. They're in books. People will write about them. You can have anthropologists from other countries and say this is what happens in Britain or this in this particular part of the United States. It's discussable. It's there. Body language, facial expressions, studied by Paul Ekman. These are human facial expressions across all cultures, which are different from a gesture, which is culturally specific. Whereas universal expressions of disgust, all cultures. Surprise, sadness, all universal. So it's like, that's the empirical part, signifying feelings. That is empirical. Facts, numbers, practical application, again, empirical. The world is possible. Now, this one is the least empirical, but it is sort of there in that it's discussable. You can debate it. And I give the example of Douglas Adams. He's writing The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He's writing the first episode. He has his two lead characters, Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent, thrown out into cosmic space. And he's made this big deal out of the fact that, look, if I don't rescue them within 30 seconds, they're going to die. Every solution he comes up with to rescuing them has the problem that it's all highly improbable, and he can't come up with a solution. Then he just happens to be watching a program on judo, and he hears the judo instructor say, use your opponent's weight against him. And he hears that and he goes, ooh, sort of intuitive, oh, there's something there. And he's sort of, it's something in that, and he's able to extract the principle. And the intuition part is able to go from use your opponent's weight against himself to use the weight of the problem against himself. So it's sort of like abstracted to a higher level, the weight of the problem against himself. And then using that problem, he then goes back and then he looks at his own and he goes, okay, what's my problem? Improbability. How do I use the improbability against itself? By creating the infinite improbability generator, which generates a field of improbability. And because it generates that field, is then able to explain why they get rescued by the ship with the infinite improbability drive on it, because it was so improbable, and rescued by people that Arthur and Ford know. So that is an example of NE, and you can say in that sort of story that it's there, that connection between use the weight of the problem against itself and use the weight of the opponent against itself. That's sort of there. It's discussable. Whereas with NI, you've got more of a personal sort of vision of how something is going to develop and not as empirical in that any sort of going off something, it's discussable. Yeah, because there. And then instincting. Sensory instinctual data. Discuss sexual attraction, excitement, fear of snakes, spine, all show up in, bound up with the sensory. Yeah, you can read that. And then here, yeah, it's going to be, and in the extrovert, the extroversion is active rather than passive. It is active rather than passive. Now here, the situational introverter. So when does the ENTJ become subjective? Self-reflective. So I'm going to go through this. Yeah, situational. So Compared to the personal row in Victor Galenka's Model G, the situational row is less specific. It can include the personal, e.g. the ENTP resemble a Wilma twin, lean and nice screenplay, blah, 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 blah. And while she reflects, she can access her weakest function, Fi. However, the situation includes something the personal does not. So this is the idea. So in Model G, Victor Galenka would have it that the ENTJ accesses Ni and Fi when on its territory. So if we go meta, it's just this idea of the person will access their situational functions, so their introverting functions within the extrovert when the person is on its territory. But what about situations that force somebody to go to their situational functions? Outside of that, again, there's a theme in socionics of narrowness. So that's what I put here. Overly precise. The difference between accuracy and precision. Sometimes in order to be accurate, you have to admit that there's not a precise answer. So our situation includes something the personal does not. The idea that certain situations draw on certain faculties, which are opposite vertness to the type, e.g. situations which draw on the introverting functions of the extrovert, even when the extrovert is not on their territory, is not in their sort of like safe space. So there, when the extrovert pauses to ponder, consider how something might develop out of a moment of inspiration from within. When a present experience, or they might have, say, ENTJ might go into Fi, but a good example might say in a close relationship of, you'd say the personal, you could say, oh, it's on its territory and it's opening up in a close relation. That would fit the box, the small box that you get in Model G. But what about when ENTJ goes into Fi when it doesn't want to go into Fi, when it's not a case of being on your territory, then it's a case of, oh, there's a dilemma that you've been sort of forced into by the situation. It's not a case of going into Fi because the ENTJ is comfortable. The situation can force the ENTJ to go into Fi when it is uncomfortable because the situation forces it. Because say the ENTJ may have done something that was a little, that others may have criticized the ENTJ for being a little bit heartless and not considering people enough. Or maybe the ENTJ lost a relationship through working too hard and they're sort of like their marriage is in trouble and they're going to be forced into Fi. And that's not a case of territory. That's not a case of, oh, I'm happy, I'm going to go to Fi, which would be with, like, say you have an ENTJ character and you showed them in a relationship and it's a happy relationship. You could say, okay, at close range, they're going to go into Fi. So it's not just a case of going into your situational functions because you're in your happy place, because it's in your personal distance. You can go there situationally. Like that. I got here about going into dilemma. Is assessed when the person what feels right to it personally. Right, and then we've got introversion there. Yeah, and I said there that I changed what Jung wrote because what he originally wrote was a little bit hard to understand. I mean, I could show you what he originally wrote just to show you how I cleaned it up. I think I will do that. Just to show you how I clean this up. Right. Introversion. It's about because first of all, I changed libido to interest because that's what it's correlated to. Because I read that in a different book of Jung's. Right. Here we go. Right. I do not hypothesize the concept of energy, but employ it as a concept merely denoting the intensity of value. Frequently I employ the expression libido promiscuously with energy. Right, anyway, so I'm looking for introversion. Right. Here we go. What was the bit that was complex? Right, here we go. It is passive when the subject is unable to restore again to the object the libido which is streaming back from it. That's when it's passive. Right? It is passive when the subject is unable to restore again to the object the libido which is streaming back from it. So there's an example of I cleaned that up. Right, so interest does not move towards the object but recedes towards the subject. So that was anything in quotes is from you, and then I put some clean up sentences in. Introverting has more interest in the subjective experience than in the object or external stimulus. Everyone whose attitude is introvert thinks, feels, and acts in a way that clearly demonstrates the subject is chief factor, while the object is at most receives only a secondary value. Right. What was that bit there? About passive introversion. Right, that would be in the other yeah, I sort of put that in the other profile about that where I cleaned that up about the libido. It's basically what you do is you translate libido to interest because that's what it's correlated to. And that was in his previous book on the unconscious, which it got renamed later on, that book. Anyway, so I read about libido in there, and basically it's sort of correlated with interest. Right, various kinds of interest. So now you got a handle on what default is and what situational is after 22 minutes. Right. And I will get on to some Keirsey stuff. So we've got TeNi, they see that. I'll get on to the NI. Is there anything, if I need to go make those bigger, in case you can't see it? If I do the next with the NI, if you pause that and then you can read that about the downtime and about the downtime and the through time, two NLP ideas to help explain NI, and that it is the opposite of stabilizing, where stabilizing is sort of going with what works and the tried and true, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's the attitude of guardians. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Whereas NI, it's like how to develop it, how to improve it. Now, especially with rationals, the NTJs, it's how to develop processes, objects rather than people. NFJs are about improving, developing people. Diplomatic enabling. NTJs, it's about, typically, it's about objects. Although you can get some ENTJs in diplomatic enabling, such as Catherine Favre. She's ENTJ, but she's an ENTJ with ADHD, so she'll type as ENTP. Right, but she's got a lot of TE in that when she talks about Enneagram, she'll say the research says, the research says, the research says. She's always going to the data, Catherine Favre. It just makes sense that if you're an ENTJ and you've got ADHD, and she's talked about having ADHD, you're going to score as a P just because of the ADHD. So I'm going to put some meat on the bones of this about what TE and NI looks like together. First of all, I'm going to give you something on intuition. There you go, if you want to pause that. This is from Conscious Orientation by Johannes Hermanus van der Hoop. Oh, that's something from, I'll get into that later. What am I looking at? Oh, yes. Right. So there's something from Keirsey about getting your sequence of operations correct towards a long-term strategic objective. Yeah, and he mentions sort of like, right, so you can see there that this correlates to that the social role draws on those two functions, Ni and Te. And he does another one, the coordinators. He changed his terminology between please understand me too and personology. I usually use the personology terms. So getting the steps correct and then the serial arrangement. So very useful in like CEO stuff. This ability to like think years in advance and get the steps correct towards that goal and adjust the plan on the fly. Whereas that's harder for SJs. SJs can be very like sequential and plan ahead, but when the plan goes, so it's almost like the ENTJ, if you compare the ENTJ and the STJ, the ENTJ is a bit more goal focused and the ESTJ is a bit more process focused. And the ENTJ can sort of like, with what comes up, they can sort of swerve around it and adjust the processes towards the goal. Because of that abstract strategic thinking, long range thinking. And then that's in contrast. Right, contingency plans, contingency intent. So this is an idea in Keirsey of so it's like what, because Keirsey had a system of intellects which is as close as he's going to get to functions, but it's because Keirsey did a PhD on intelligence and he abandoned the PhD because he didn't think that the IQ tests were fair to all of the temperaments. So for example, you've got IQ tests typically, well, they focus, I mean, even if you think of the 7 kinds of intelligence that you get, like, and this is how you remember them. You remember the 3 that IQ tests can measure. Visuospatial intelligence, logico-mathematical, and verbal intelligence. So IQ tests measure 3, but they can't measure the other 4 out of the big 7. Musical intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, and intrapersonal intelligence. So there's 2 that idealists can be really good at that they get shortchanged on in IQ tests. And generally, idealists will do well at the verbal IQ. NTs get sort of favored in IQ tests because they generally do well on average with the logico-mathematical and the, to a lesser extent, the visuospatial. Artisans, if you've got artisans that are good with like kinesthetic and like those, the tests are not testing what they're good at. So this is why Keirsey came up with socially intelligent roles that, and so socially intelligent roles that we can sort of judge all of the types against. And so it's like he came up with these sort of 4 IQs: the diplomatic IQ, the logistical IQ, the strategic IQ, and the tactical IQ. And he was in World War II, David Keirsey. So I'm just gonna right, that's SE max. Just think SPs. Right. So you've got these these various kinds of roles and sort of like, so it's like Keirsey was saying, by default, your artisans are best at tactical manipulator, and that you have a correspondence there. So, for example, the promoter, which can become the con man, the type which is naturally set up for that is ESTP. Think Donald Trump, think Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon, super ESTP, Vince McMahon. You got your ISTP there, and then the sort of the, so it's like, this is a way of sort of like getting your functions correct in your definitions, because it's like, so ENTJ is very good at this role, the mobilizer, the sort of the CEO role, and we can say that that correlates with TE and NI together. But it also brings in this third function. What a segue to get back on track. Fish is water. So you frequently have ENTJ in business coming up with a lot of ideas, but it's going through that filter. Does it fit with the plan? Does it fit with the TENI plan? You can adjust the plan because they are good at adjusting the plan. But if it's a completely different plan, file it away, next project, because the ENTJ is very good at like getting the project completed and then moving on to another project. They're very good at follow through, at project completion. And that's where they have an advantage over ENTP. ENTP probably have more ideas because there's more exploration, sort of more dabbling, more sort of, the ENTJ might say that they're a dilettante on average. The ENTP is more of a dilettante than the ENTJ, whereas ENTP might say that ENTJ is less creative. So there's a lot of exploration going on with NE. So exploration in the world and exploration of ideas. And so ENTJ might think, well, it's inefficient to just sort of like exploring and having fun with ideas. So you can sort of see that. So what I was saying there about actively exploring possibilities. But so how might ENTJ use NE? We'll sort of see the gap in the market. Oh, there's a possibility there. Oh, there's demand there. And so it's going through that filter. It's feeding the TE and the NI. So it really is again, these are unsung allies. These are strong functions, but they are unvalued. Now, depending on the person, it depends how much they develop. So you could get some and I'll get into that later when I get onto slot 4, but the NE there, it's feeding T and NI. Yeah. And it probably depends what kind of line of work the ENTJ in is, like to how useful the NE is. But again, it's going to be filtering it. Not just ideas for ideas' sake. It's like, just like that line for INTJ, it's going to be every idea is subject to the test of usefulness. So ENTJ is probably a lot more NE than you can actually see from the outside, just like ignoring it. Or they see it as sort of obvious. Right. Again, file it away for future projects. Yeah, I mean, you can see the various, looking at things different point of view. The fish that doesn't know it's wet, the ENTJ fish doesn't know it's wet with NE. The fish doesn't know it's wet. Or modest servant, it serves the TE. This is why Vanderhoek would have called this type the extroverted thinking type with subsidiary intuition. When Dario Nardi agrees with like the TENX thing, that's what the research shows, because it shows that people score high for the function in that third slot. Now for TI. So there's going to be some times where ENTJ is going to need to, now it's going to access, I would think that based on a Keirsey dichotomy, that ENTJ is going to use TI more than ESTJ because ENTJ is utilitarian. And when someone is utilitarian in the sense of doing it their own way, rather than default going by the book, then the ENTJ will use more TI in a certain way. Now, what you could argue, though, with ESTJ is that they are using a lot of TI. It's just that it's subjective, because what they're going off is all of the books that they've read and their temperament. And that sort of all becomes sort of subjective, in that it's like it's different and it might be personal to that individual, and it's subjective in that it's colored by the temperament. But generally, in terms of, if you're looking in intelligent actions from the outside, you can go, okay, I can see that ENTJ there, not going by the book, trying new things, being more utilitarian and less by the book. So it looks like they're using more TI, because I do associate TI with sort of like utilitarian thinking, because like ISFJ is TI tertiary, but you do not see a lot of utilitarian thinking from ISFJ. So it's like, how is the thinking in ENTJ subjective? Well, maybe you could say that their thinking is also colored by their NI as well. They've got that strong internal vision of how something's going to develop. I mean, in a low interest rate environment, you can have even NTJs like invest in a lot of crazy stuff, because low interest rates, artificially low interest rates lower than they would be set in the free market. Because in a free market with no Federal Reserve, no central bank, the interest rate would be set by the sort of the natural supply of savings. So if there were a lot of savings, interest rates would be naturally low. But what does that correspond to, folks? If you've got a lot of savings, that's from underconsumption, and that means there's a lot of resources out there available, and so the interest rate will be low. If you've got smaller pool of savings, that means there's been a small amount of underconsumption, which means that there is a small amount of resources available. And again, supply and demand, there's a small amount of resources available, therefore the price to borrow money to reallocate those resources is going to be higher. So it relates to something real. I've been listening to Peter Schiff since 2009. I listen to more Peter Schiff than I have a typology stuff. Right. Hyperinflation is coming. So the fourth. So I think their TI is going to be colored by their NI and their sort of strategic intellect and their grand visions. Also, maybe the ego could maybe get in there with the TI. Yeah. Sort of thinking about how generally they're going off data. Remember what Catherine Farmer says? The research says, the research says, the research says. And she did a lot of studies on Enneagram. Right. That's how she says that she came up with a tri-type, in that it kept coming up in the data. Right. So the next one, we sort of go into another club. Now we're going to an SF club. And now we're going to SE. Now then, body language. Body language. So there's a couple of people on YouTube I like to look at. Ty Lopez, when he used to like have that house behind him that he didn't own, he just did it for the advert, and he's like saying that sort of puffs his chest out. And it's like ENTJ like trying to be ESTP. Then look at this other guy. Look at Wesley Virgin, how he moves like a panther, so gracefully and fluidly. Like there's an SE Dom, and then you've got an ENTJ that's trying to do SE. And so that's what it can sort of come off as, this sort of dabbling SE. The tertiary that's trying to be a dominant. Right, and this is where I can say something a bit more, I suppose, long-winded. I'm going to get to that, and then I'm going to show the other ones. If you see that, there's like your full explanation of slot 5 and what's going on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then I'm going to change the slide. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And one of the reasons I'm doing the countdown is because on the recording, it takes a while to get sharper. It's just the way the processing works, especially with something like this. I might have to count to 10 on this one because the more still it is, the sort of get less blocky in the way it's just like the way the compression works. So 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, now we're going to go back to the club. Right, there's some points in there that you might need to think about in that, because I found a flaw in Model G. About the relationship between energy and information. Right. And just leave it on there so it focuses. Well, not focuses, but an equivalent. Something analogous to focusing, and just the way it sort of renders. Right, there's something more on clubs and Dario's data. That should be quite clear. And then I'm going to go here. And again, if you want to pause it and read it, and then here, pause it and read it. And again, that's about the strength of those slots. And again, slot 3. It's 3 and 4. So you've seen about slot 5. The type thinks it's better at it than what it is. Now, what can happen is someone can get better at that slot than through development. Again, if there's enough external factor. So, say you had a situation, there's an example. Right, so David Keirsey is an INTP that gets drafted into World War II. And he wrote about not being like a natural pilot and him finding it difficult to sort of like to navigate. So imagine though you had there a similar, in World War II, you had someone who was ENTJ preferences and they also get drafted into World War II and they become pilots. Now you've got a situation where the circumstances are going to draw more on SE, draw more on that, especially that paying attention and immersing in the present context. And so the situation is going to develop the SE in the ENTJ in that situation. Or say you got an ENTJ in a tough part of Brazil. Again, develop the SE. So it doesn't mean that it's always dabbling. The circumstances can develop the function. Yeah, and a bit more here on uptime and in time. I'm gonna, there you go, see what goes on there. You can see how the SE DOMs are going to be best at that by default. Yes, it's a default function, but the main default function is TE, but it is one of the default functions. If they're doing a lot of SEing, they're going to develop it. Oh yes, that column, B-side. Right, so yeah, so you got Catherine Farber who thinks she's really good at, I'm not saying she isn't, I'm just saying she thinks she's really good at the SE stuff, especially being Enneagram 8 fixated. You know, but like I started to get a little bit like in those situations when people really think they've got an SE and go, oh, so you're a cage fighter, are you? Like, or you're a pilot or a surgeon, or you're really good at sort of like acting in the moment. Yeah. And so again, there's that other side of the personality, and again, it depends on development. You probably have got some ENTJ pilots and surgeons. B side of the personality, yeah, intertype relations. They're attracted to people that have good use of SE and FI. It's that quadra, the NTJs and the SFPs. Right, so let's look at the suggestible function. So what we could say with Catherine Farber is all the stuff she does with Enneagram is probably her suggestible FI. That's how suggestible she is for FI. And if you look at David Farber, and I think he's a 4, so her former husband of a long time, you might think, oh, could there have been a duality relationship there with ISFP David and ENTJ Catherine? All right, and now that sort of synergy. In that, because they came up with a lot of Enneagram stuff together. Right. Right. Empathy. Yes, this is something that the ENTJ will develop more as they go along, especially when they get over 30. Or I imagine them becoming a parent, sort of developing that feeling side, sort of like what is important. And so it's like, so they know how to form a goal and develop, but what is, it's almost like on a spiritual level, what is the outcome of the outcome? Once that goal has been achieved, what is sort of the purpose? And especially if they're Enneagram 3 fixated. Like, what is the importance of achievement? And in that, if you think there's if there's a theme in Hollywood, it started in the 70s. There's a film called North Dallas 40, and it's called The Redemption Plot, and it's sort of a critique of Enneagram 3 values, where somebody is trying so hard to achieve something, but they're sort of like destroying themselves. They're corrupting themselves in the pursuit of this goal. And so you have in the North Dallas 40, you've got an American football player wide receiver played by Nick Nolte, and he's just bashing up his body playing American football. And in the final scene, goes to catch the ball to win the touchdown, puts his arms wide apart and lets the ball hit his chest and fall to the ground. So basically, he said, I'm not going to play this silly game anymore. So what he's done there is he's actually won. His loss is actually a win because he's outgrown the game. It's like taking that larger perspective. It's not worth it. And you can get this with the ENTJs. I'll get onto this when they get onto the SI. They can overwork themselves. So this SF half of them is about finding out what is really important in life and developing that. What is the point of these huge achievements? That if you could, like, these relationships are sacrificed. So FI needs developing that, and also something Dario and Nardi noticed, that in a rational type, all the rational functions can be integrated. So all of these can be integrated. If all these rational functions working together help the TE. If the FI is integrated, it's like, what is the outcome of the outcome? Does it fit in fit in with the life, like the ecology and NLP term of view, like if you get this outcome, how does it affect the rest of your life? Is it as in balance with FE, like people needs and material success needs, and there's balance there, work-life balance, and a balance of values. Yeah, it's sort of like life fulfilling. So it's like, but that gets towards like Enneagram 3 stuff of like, is it achievement for achievement's sake, or once it's been achieved, now what? What do I do now? And it's like, what does the ENTJ do next? You can get that. You can get like someone who like succeeds in business, might succeed early in business. They might have been like flogging their guts out from like in their 20s, and they get to about 50 odd and they're successful in business, and it's like, now what? So looking for something else. It's like that FI is coming along, now what? There's something deeper. Again, FE stuff. And that can work in synergy with TE. Think of companies that have a company policy or company ethics. Because if you've got say, and frequently an ENTJ with 3 fix or even 3 lead is going to use a lot of FE for networking, and could be social instinct, not last. So an FE with a company ethos, and like business is not just TE. There's also FE in business. The customer is always right. And I remember there was a guy on talking about fences in America, that he wants to use the sort of the British method of constructing fences because he says it's what's best for the customer. So that just that thing, that point of view, the customer is always right, and customer service and people coming back. So FE can be very important in business. Reputation, because then someone gets recommended by somebody else. So FE can work in business. Again, that having that strong reputation and after sales service, we could say that's all FE stuff. Again, they might have a thought process of treating their employee. Now, Peter Schiff would say, well, it's obvious you should do that because of your reputation, because he doesn't realize that other people like sometimes slack in that area and they don't do the logical thing. Or you might say sort of the morale of the workforce, having the right atmosphere as a CEO, getting the right sort of team spirit. So FE can be used there. And again, so that's something that can be developed. But the ENTJ can typically use FE just for sort of networking, just to sort of achieve TE ends. Sort of develop a sort of superficial charisma. And the reason it's low down there is it's not genuinely sort of like really focused on other people's needs. It's more using FE as a tool to achieve other things, and reputation and people skill and network, and not actually actively caring for other people, because that involves SI. And they don't really take care of themselves. So ENTJs can really overwork themselves because of that, with that pursuit of those goals, and they can get burnout. It's possible that Tick, the YouTuber, that's the Tick history, he could be ENTJ. He's had burnout. ESTJ is less likely to burn out. More likely to go, nah, I've done my time, now I'm going home. Whereas the more overtime with the ENTJ, so they get caught up in that vision and like burn themselves out the way ENFJ can as well. Again, yeah, weakest function, SI, burnout. And as you can see from those slots, I should mention these. I'll just zoom in there so you can see it. Yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is the attitude of SI. If you want to pause that. Right, so opposite of ISFJ, Like, they just don't see it as important. This is sort of attention to their, and they don't really in touch with their bodies because they're always thinking about the goal and long-range planning. They overwork themselves. Stress-related illnesses. There's a guy that sort of helped with bringing the Amiga X1000 back, and I've forgotten his name, but he went grey. British entrepreneur. Yeah, I think ENTJ sort of worked himself. And so you see those slots there with slot 8. It's not a club function. It's not an NT function. It's not an extroverted function. It's not a default function. And it's not a valued function. So it's definitely the weakest function in the NTJ. Now, to a certain extent, you could almost say it's binary as well, where ENTJ, if they have a bit of a problem in this area, they can sort of overcompensate and become a bit of a health freak. So all or nothing binary sense to it. And then these other ones show how they can sort of move around, sort of depending on development. Like, again, this one's slot 5. As I mentioned there with, say, World War II, if an ENTJ became a pilot, they'd have to use more SE. Or maybe you got an ENTJ that went into a sort of a line of business that required a bit more TI. Might develop that. So there is that interaction between the natural predisposition and the natural talents, and then the environment, and the environment drawing on, and the environment sort of leading towards certain activities and tasks that draw on different functions, and because they get used more, they get trained up. So this sort of like affecting each other between nature and nurture. So, but the research would show. Oh yeah, so yeah, I have something about the imaginative. What they might do is, because I once heard something in an LP that some people, when they recall, actually construct the memory, even though they're recalling it, they're actually constructing it in different pieces. And I wondered, could that be SI binary like ENTJs and ENFJs, where they're actually constructing a recall? They're not making it up, but they're actually constructing it from different pieces. So it's like they're not quite good at remembering, like, unless it's really important information. So that's sort of a way of doing SI where they're not great. But again, it could be binary, where if you overcompensate in that area. So I'll say something about the clubs before I go. Oh, and then I'll talk about instinctive, because I like to bang. Okay, those are the other types. The other types. All the types. So let's put what Dario got here. So this, again, this is Dario's in his book. And it gives the example of ENFJ. And so it's like this information about where I've got slot 3 and slot 4 in my model is backed up by Dario's research. And this is from the Keys to Cognition test. He calls it the Cognitive Processes Assessment. There, this suggests that pairs of functions such as sense and thinking, that's ST, sense and feeling, that's SF, intuitive thinking, that's NT, intuitive feeling, that's NF, are highly relevant. So basically, clubs, importance of clubs. And even there with like ENFJ, if the highest scores of extroverting feeling with support supposed to, and he even writes that you should maybe write it as NITX, TI, NX. You know, and you sort of saw that for me, because we did some videos. So you saw that with me, because I started to do that in 2015. Yeah, because I wanted to sit on the fence, because Victor said that INTP was TINI, and I thought, oh, I don't want to go that far. So I thought, okay, I can see your point, Victor. I'll say INTP is TINX. So that's where it started. But then before that, Vanderhoek was banging on about it. Because like you've got Vanderhoek going on about how strong NI is in INTP. So that part of the model, me calling this TINX, is consistent with Van der Hoek in 1937. Now I'm going to talk about, well, I'm not going to talk about this much. You can pause that. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In order to, and then I'll bang on about SE. So this is the instinct where, so here's the thing, with the non-sensing functions, the non-instinctive functions, you can get to a definition by intersecting two ideas. You can intersect verting and the function. So you can intersect extroverting and thinking and get to a definition of TE just by intersecting those two ideas. But if you were to intersect the ideas of extroverting with sensing, you wouldn't get these things here in yellow, because that's from the temperament. So that is the temperament factor. What you would get if you intersected sensing with extroverting is you possibly get in the moment and sensory acuity, but you wouldn't get impulses and enjoying that, because that's coming from the instinct and gut instincts, and exciting, because exciting is emotion. That's the thing, because emotion is bound up with sensor. There's a difference between emotion and feeling, and Van der Hoek goes into the difference. Now, it is sort of remarked upon in the structure of the brain, there is a limbic system, and feelings are more cerebral, and emotions are more limbic. So I can give you an example of, so you could say in sexual attraction, you've got emotion bound up with the senses. With disgust, turn over a rock, and there's like worms and that lot under there. And it's like, ugh. That is disgust. You've got the sensory bound up with the emotional. What are you supposed to say? Is that FE or FI? No, that is bound up with it. With touch, the sense of touch is bound up with the emotional. Emotion is different from feeling. Feeling is more complex. Now, there's a few definitions. If you look it up, there are a few. Every now and then you get something that's self-contradictory, but there is a difference between feeling and emotion. If you see the psychology. Right. Now, I'm not just going to stop because this is the final abstract type. I'm going to do the 8 concrete types. Yeah, so these are some of the ways that you can look at functions. So Dario Nardi, what he's done with the EEG, you can say social role enactment is like how they correlate with the function pairs, and sometimes triads in Keirsey, like enforcing the rules would be TESI and SE. Again, yeah, TE inductive. Like so Catherine Farber saying, the research says, the research says, the research says, oh, that sounds like TE, Catherine. Rather than going because of this, you can see that linguistically, physiological, like INTJs, INTJ face, ISTJs, they present very differently from ESFJ. You shouldn't mix them up in terms of affect display. Now that doesn't mean that, oh, you raise your eyebrow using FI, but there are these general patterns with certain functions. There we go. So there we go. I think I'm going to stop now after I have pointed to this display model. Oh, there's Ludwig von Mises and Peter Schiff. Have you clicked like? Have you commented and have you subscribed? I hope you do. Bye-bye.